Greetings. Good Wednesday morning, the 17th of January, 2024. 2024. Fifth year, third decade, 21st century. It's my first video of the year, and if you're new to my channel, I always open with that to try to hyper-emphasize the fact that we are well into the third decade of the 21st century, to sort of emphasize the point. What are we talking about? What are the issues we're dealing with versus where scholarly people had once predicted us to be as a society, as a human society, a race of beings, so to speak, colonizing the moon or Mars or whatnot. But instead, we're talking about certain issues, depending on the issue itself, like it's the 1950s and 60s. As I was trying to figure out a topic to talk about, one of the guys I served with way back during my first and beginning of my second enlistment, a gentleman by the name of Sidney Smith. For the life of me, I cannot remember where Sidney was from, so allow me a little bit of context, if you will. And I'm gonna tell you right now, this video may go a little bit longer than my normal videos. If I can try and edit it down, I will, but I might not even edit it at all. So this may be one of those videos where it's less about watching and more about listening. So Sidney and I are about a year apart. We're both born in the 70s, grew up to a point in the 80s, but spent our teenage years in the 90s in high school before subsequently joining the Marine Corps. I'm originally from the Chicagoland area, where I basically was low income, and I grew up in apartment complexes until about the age of 13, when my mom and my stepdad bought a house in a different suburb of Chicago where they could afford it. And that's when I noticed the most significant changes of all. Up until that point, the first 13 years of my life living in the apartment complexes, the one thing that doesn't discriminate and doesn't segregate, if nothing else, it discriminates wholeheartedly, is low income. And typically, apartment complexes, for the most part, are where people with not a lot of money tend to live. Because it cuts out a lot of things like maintenance and yard maintenance and whatnot, where all you have to do is pay your rent and pay your basic utilities. And it's great for bachelors just starting out, it's great for young couples just starting out, and it's an affordable option for families who can't afford many other options. So it's also a place of tremendous diversity. Not just the schools I went to up until that point, but in the apartment complexes I lived in, we had brown, we had white, we had black, we had yellow, we had other versions of brown, say Middle Eastern, Indian, we had Asian, we had everybody, all right? And we as kids, we didn't give a shit. Hey, kid, do we like the same thing? Do we have similar interests? Hey, let's play. Let's trade baseball cards. Let's do a pickup game in an open field of football or wiffle ball or whatever. We just got along. It wasn't until I moved into this house, reluctantly, by the way. It wasn't exactly my choice, but at 13, what choices do you have? The neighborhood I moved into is where I first started to feel a real sense of discrimination. I guess apartment complexes are kind of known for being transient, so transient kids get to know each other a little bit better and just, I guess, have a different way of dealing with the world. When I first moved into my neighborhood was somewhat diverse. I mean, basically we had majority white, we had some black, and we had some brown. I don't remember a whole lot of anything else. I don't remember if we had any Indians, and I don't mean Native Americans, but I mean, actual no shit Indians. I don't know about that many Asians. We lived in an older part of town, which was, I guess, at that point in time, lower income as well. But the kids that grew up there had been there since birth, and they'd known each other since birth, and they've never known anything else. That was a hard nut to crack. They were not what I would call the most welcoming. We get along now, but for fuck's sakes, I'm almost 48, so we get along now. When I got into junior high, what you would call middle school now, that was the first time I started to feel actual racism, where people of skin pigmentation other than white felt a tremendous sense of pride towards their skin color. And I don't know why, unless it's an age thing, unless it's a maturity thing, unless it's part of growing up. Living in the apartment complexes and going through elementary school onto junior high, I mean, I'd started junior high living in apartment complexes, even 8th grade, and I don't remember skin color being an issue. I just don't. But when I moved into a house, and I moved into this town where, unbeknownst to me, but when they shut down a lot of Section 8 housing in the south side of Chicago, they relocated people to various suburbs, Bolingbrook being one of them. But it was the first time I had encountered other kids that put a lot of pride and a lot of precedence on their skin color, and it wasn't white kids. And it was just, you know, a little awkward to deal with. And that would carry on into high school. And what I remember from high school is, and I'll be completely honest, I don't know, I can't remember the timeline as far as whether or not they're related, but right around the exact same time, I got into high school, and still, we had kids that were very proud of their skin color. Around that same time, I don't know how to label it, but it felt like what was like a black awakening, where a lot of the high school students were wearing Malcolm X t-shirts, Martin Luther King t-shirts, black culture, primarily because of like Spike Lee, and I don't know the exact timeline or accountability for it, but black filmmakers were making a big wave back in the early 90s, with stuff like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, South Central. Spike Lee was doing a lot of movies at the time, and black culture was getting a real big push. And not just the culture itself, but like the pride in the skin color. Russell Simmons had the Def Comedy Jam. Rap music was blowing up, in no small part in thanks to NWA. And I remember all of these things, and I remember the kids walking around school with a lot of Africa referenced shirts, a lot of Cross Colors was a real big one, and then Karl Kani, I'm gonna butcher this, but Martinique Gerbeau, and if I didn't mention it already, Cross Colors was a real big one. And I remember the t-shirts, it's a black thang, T-H-A-N-G, you just wouldn't understand. These aren't subjects I haven't talked about already. I've talked about them ad nauseum already. But I'm giving you some significant context for a reason. All through high school, there was a significant precedence placed on pride, skin pride at least, within the black community. The Latinx community, or whatever the hell is considered appropriate now, anybody who spoke Spanish or came from a Spanish origin, they had their own pride, but I don't feel like they pushed it that much. The only thing I recall is I came close to dating a Hispanic girl, and her brothers found out because I was friends with the brothers, and they were like, "Hey man, we're still cool, but you can't do this." And the darndest thing was, like, God forbid I got her pregnant, and I polluted the bloodline. And I was like, appreciate the wishful thinking. I'm glad that you think I have that much game that, you know, we're going to have the sex and I'm going to get her pregnant, but, you know, okay, roger that. And that was really about the extent of it. But I don't remember the brown pride thing getting as big a push. But again, we still had Asians. We still had, you know, a wide selection of people growing up, where we had diversity, and the black pride thing wasn't so overwhelming that we as non-black students couldn't deal with it, that we couldn't continue to go to school and not feel threatened. I mean, it wasn't like a threatening thing. It just was like, hey, it's the 90s. It's a different decade. It's not the 80s, and these students are finally being allowed to express their pride in their skin color where maybe they didn't feel that way. And honestly, that's kind of how we felt back in the day. But I guess a lot of it is age, where some people care about things and some people don't. And me and most of the people I hung out with, we could care less. They're like, yeah, cool, it's a black thing, whatever. What's up? And for what I remember, the majority of us got along. I don't remember anybody not really getting along because of your skin color. I do remember there were a very, very, very small group of individuals that were a bit more militant than others, that like took it to a bit extreme, but nothing that was like, oh my God, I can't go to school, oh my God. And more importantly, I don't remember our parents being as involved to the point of even giving a shit. So back then in the 90s, I did what a lot of people in my situation would do if they had the gumption to do so, and that was I joined the military. Why? Well, growing up between the 80s and the 90s, everybody said you got to get a degree, you got to get a degree. Back then, the trades were not considered well off. The trades were not considered, well-to-do. They were not considered like a point of success. So it was like college, college, college. Notice nobody ever told us what to study. Just go to college and get a degree. Because apparently, showing somebody that you could show up on time, absorb the material, put in the legwork, complete the assignments, get the grade and graduate, meant a lot. And I couldn't afford to go to college. So I joined the military. Being from Illinois, Illinois at that time offered the Illinois Veterans Grant, which was supposed to pay for 120 credit hours of free tuition at a public school. So that was my whole reason for joining. I'm not going to pretend that I was this massive flag-waving patriot. Keep in mind, up until this point, my concerns were very, very internal. All right, I'm joining the military to pay for college. I like women. That was about like the extent of my concerns. Go to boot camp. While I'm in boot camp, again, I get to experience some real racism. But I'm going to be fair and I'm going to be honest. So back then in the 90s, if you were in the Central Time Zone, the Mountain Time Zone, or the Pacific Time Zone, you went to San Diego for boot camp. All the ladies would go to Parris Island, and anybody on the Eastern Time Zone would go to Parris Island. So I went to boot camp in San Diego, and even then in boot camp, I met white dudes that were racist, because that's just how they were raised. Wherever they grew up in the United States, they were racist. So let's give you a little bit of context on that. I went to boot camp in the early 90s. So in the early 90s, when I graduated high school in 1994, the civil rights movement was 30 years in the rearview mirror. All right? But that doesn't mean the lingering effects weren't still being felt. That doesn't mean that people I was in boot camp with didn't come from a place where they still had parents and grandparents that had hoods and robes hanging up in the closet from back when the Klan was still viewed as important. Equally and opposite, that also meant I was in boot camp with black Marines that came from some of those states where they had to form their own communities and protect themselves, and they just grew up hating white people because where they grew up, white people hated them. I'm not saying either one of those situations are correct, but for somebody who grew up in a very diverse area where everybody got along, and if we didn't get along, it wasn't about our skin color as much as it was there was something about you I didn't like, and there was something about me you didn't like, and it had everything to do with us. It had nothing to do with pigmentation. And that's kind of how I grew up. So being exposed to that in boot camp where like, no, this is legit. These are like some cracker killing, honky hating motherfuckers, and these are some, hood wearing, freaking what the hell. And then even then, I would meet some Latin guys that also grew up extremely proud in Latin neighborhoods, Latin townships that, everybody they'd ever dealt with was Latin. Their recruiters were, Latin, and they didn't like anybody that wasn't them. And now we're all being forced to get along. And I'll never forget the handful of us that were from Chicago basically congregated together, and the guys from Detroit, so we kind of like made these little groups where you had some of us from like the north central part of the United States where we grew up very diverse. We grew up with everybody, and like we were trying to keep our sanity, because it was like we didn't fit in with these other guys. These other guys from like other states like Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma and whatever, I think, yeah, I don't know if Arkansas was, but whatever, some of these, former Confederate states and whatnot were like, racism was still very part of their makeup. We just didn't quite get along with them. Then, the same thing, you go to SOI, and clearly, what I did notice was, if anybody had local connections, it was the Brown brothers. The Latinos had connections in Southern California between like the San Diego, Camp Pendleton area, which by the time we got to the School of Infantry, we were starting to click a little bit more. We were starting to get over some of those differences, and we were starting to, kind of help each other out, and that was kind of fun. And then when it's all said and done, I graduate and I get orders to Hawaii. So again, let me give you some context there. All right. Typically speaking, if you graduate infantry training battalion on the West Coast, you go to a West Coast unit. So 1st Marines, 5th Marines, 7th Marines. Vice versa, if you graduate infantry training battalion on the East Coast, you go to an East Coast unit. You go to 2nd Marines, 6th Marines, and then back then we still had 8th Marines. The only major difference was Hawaii. Hawaii was the melting pot. Hawaii is where graduates from both East and West would merge together into one, and you literally got basically a cross-section of everybody. All right? I mean that. I think every state was, during my time in Hawaii, I think every state was represented, to include some U.S. territories. And if nothing else, the one thing we did share in common was some of the local islanders did not like us for any number of reasons. So, we bonded over that, and we bonded over our dealing with the suck. Because back then, being a younger, lower enlisted Marine, I just remember life had a bit of a suck to it. And we all just kind of bonded over embracing the suck, and we all just kind of got along. So why did I bring all this stuff up? One of the guys I served with, Sidney Smith, and I want you to get my full meaning. Regardless of the fact that he is a black guy and at that time was a black Marine, again, none of that mattered to us. I will tell you, when I met him in Bravo Company 1-3, there were a couple of guys that he served with, that we served with, that came from areas of the United States that hadn't quite progressed to the point of full-on inclusion yet. So these were guys that were being forced to play nice with people other than white because they didn't have a choice. But if they were back home, it wouldn't be an issue or a problem, because that's just the way things were. And sometimes it just is what it is. It's where you grew up, it's how you were raised, it's what you know. When I served with Sidney, back then we just called him Smith, he was a big, in-shape guy with a stupid positive attitude. You could not get this guy down. In fact, when we thought things were bad, we used to measure whether or not it's bad based on whether Smith got mad or not. Hey Smith, we're going to the field and it's raining. Cool. I guess we'll hygiene every day in the field. Better bring your soap. Free showers. Hey Smith, going on a 25-mile hike. Cool, I was feeling a little pudgy. After 25 miles, I'm going to shed some calories and be ripped. The one time we did a 25-mile, oh my God, we did a 25-mile hike, and it was probably one of the worst 25-milers any of us have ever done. And I forget what was going on, but Smith had to take his POV and use it for something. And at a stoplight intersection, he got rear-ended by a Humvee. And he was upset, but like the rest of us would be upset and be like, oh man, he's pissed. Because I can't remember if insurance was mandatory. I can't remember. I remember like stuff like that, like a fender bender was like a really big deal back in the day. Now, like you get into a fender bender, it's like, okay, what's your information? Here's my information. All right, look, you know, and it's like whatever. Back then, it wasn't like whatever. And even then, Smith was like, oh man, this sucks. But the poor guy was probably exhausted. I mean, it was 25. I'm like, no, Smith, get mad. You can get mad. I remember I was mad that he wasn't mad. Oh, this guy had a terribly infectious, positive mental attitude. A few years ago, I think I friended him on Facebook, and in the last year or so, maybe longer, because unfortunately time just goes by way too fast, he'll post a few things here and there that, for all intents and purposes, indicate that he's obviously proud of his skin color, which I don't remember being an issue for him back then. I also don't remember where he's from originally, but I don't remember him demonstrating pride in his skin color. He was just a good dude. And for all intents and purposes, Sydney, if you actually watch this video, I still think you're a good dude. I don't have any reason not to. But the one thing I have found a bit shocking, based on my ability to receive, process, and interpret information, is you seem to be demonstrating a sense of pride in your melanation that I don't remember before, but you seem to be expressing a level of concern that in the 5th year of the 3rd decade of the 21st century, racial relations, specifically targeting the black community, are as bad or worse. And I had commented on one of your posts about Martin Luther King, trying to emphasize the point that, at least for me where I grew up, the way that I was taught about Martin Luther King was that he was protesting and he was fighting for equal rights in the states where black Americans were not receiving equal treatment, specifically the segregated South, where they weren't allowed to take advantage. They had to set up their own medical clinics, or they had to go to designated medical clinics that said coloreds only. Their language, not mine. You know, just all the atrocities of Jim Crow and segregation and everything that came from that. I'm not saying northern states were better. I'm not saying northern states were, you know, bastions of equality. I mean, I can tell you firsthand, a lot of your major cities were populated by European immigrants that had to form their own communities for no other reason than protection. I mean, the mafia, both Irish and Italian, was started to protect Irish and Italian immigrants against the hatred and bigotry of the previous Europeans that were there prior. But I mean, growing up in Chicago, in the greater Chicagoland area, you know, we had Polish communities, German communities, Czech communities, did I say German? Jewish communities, Italian, Irish communities, Hispanic communities, whether Puerto Rican or Mexican. You know, we had that sort of, I guess what you might call level of segregation, but nothing like the South. So part of my comment was, I believe Martin Luther King was fighting for, you know, equal rights in states that weren't providing equal rights at that time. The same states where you will still find to this day HBUs, historically black universities, which I'd like to think, because of the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, we don't need them anymore, because now black Americans can go to any university they want to, especially if they qualify. And I also made the comment, I wonder if, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King would be happy with the status of affairs in the country today. I think we both agree that he wouldn't, but I think we agree for different reasons. Sydney, you seem to be representing what I call the great media lie. And here's what I will say. I want to quantify it with this. Just like you'll never know what it's like to be a red-headed stepchild, you'll never know what it's like to be a white guy, you'll never know what it's like to be a white guy that grew up in the Chicagoland area. You know, whatever it is that makes me me, you'll never know what that's like. And vice versa. I'll never know what it's like to be you. I'll never know what it's like to be a black male growing up in America. I'll never know what it's like to, you know, potentially feel that awkwardness when I walk in someplace that, you know, people feel uncomfortable around black Americans. I do know what it's like to walk into places where white people are not the normal and white people are not welcome. Been there, done that. Hell, for crying out loud, Sydney, I think if memory serves me correctly, that was several places in Hawaii where if you weren't Polynesian, you couldn't go. But that being said, I'm not going to try to pretend like neither one of us can know what it's like to be us and what we're thinking and feeling based on the sum total of our experiences. If America is suffering any kind of racial inequality, racial division, racial separation, I think a lot of it has to do with the media. I think a lot of it has to do with the people in charge that own these media companies pushing this narrative of white supremacy, white privilege, systemic racism. I don't believe in any of it. But I believe that there are people who have done the math and have found that there is profit, that there is a long-term investment with long-term gains to be made by trying to stoke the fires of racial division within this country. I mean, for crying out loud, you know, we're entertaining concepts like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, and pardon the jokes, but, you know, diversity hires versus best hires. I think, Sydney, if I'm not mistaken, you drive a truck, and which means you have to share the road with other truck drivers. So I ask you this, would you much rather work with and share the road with the best truck drivers, or would you much rather work with and share, you know, and share a reputation with diversity hires? You know, not the best, but hired specifically for the purpose of diversity. You know, think back to our time in the Marine Corps. I mean, you know, you're one of those guys that, from what I remember, if we had to put together an A team from Bravo, let alone 1-3, let alone the Marine Corps, you would have been a part of it. Not because of what you looked like, but because of who you were, how you performed, your positive mental attitude, your physical capabilities. That positive mental attitude goes a long way, too. Now try to imagine trying to put together an A team based on diversity, not who can shoot the best, not who can do the Marine Corps stuff the best, but, well, you know, we need a fat guy, there's a fat guy. We need a brown guy, there's a brown guy. Yeah, but he can't do 3 pull-ups, but he's brown. I mean, we're entertaining such nonsense, which is why I like using things like the 5th year of the 3rd decade of the 21st century, because where we may agree and yet disagree at the same time, it's like all the progress and all of the accomplishments of Dr. Martin Luther King are being washed away by these people who are convinced that there is some monetary gain, there is some profit to be made by driving a wedge between us and selling these lies. And for me, personally, when I see some of the things you post on Facebook, I can't help but wonder if you're believing the lie that comes directly from the media. And allow me to defend that statement. We only ever hear of crimes when it's white persons or white people against people of color. We only hear about police interactions when it's the police against people of color or somebody from the alphabet mafia. And the cop has to be white. We don't hear about anything else. And trust me, it happens. Statistically speaking, You're at greater risk of being shot and killed or beaten by the police if you're white. Now, I'll throw you a bone. We are larger in numbers. And therefore, our 10%ers, 10% of a million is 100,000. So if there's 100,000 jackasses within the white community, yeah, we're probably, statistically at greater risk. But my point being the same, you don't hear about this. When people of color commit racially motivated crimes against white people or people other than their color, you don't hear about it. Instead, they paint it differently, like, oh, stop Asian hate. Okay, who's committing the overwhelming crimes against the Asian population? It's not white people. But that's not how, because it changes the narrative, because it goes against what the narrative desires. You have to say it completely differently. Stop anti-Semitism. Well, who's being anti-Semitic? So I can't stand the way the media is doing it. And the one thing I've learned in my almost 48 years of life is the concept of confirmation bias. When you've allowed yourself to believe in something and you believe in it to the point where you cannot absorb any outside information that would contradict your belief. Religion's notorious for this. People with devout religious beliefs, anything that would contradict that belief, anything that would shine a dark light against it, their confirmation bias blinds them from it. Sydney, I don't know if that's you. I don't know if where you're at right now, if some total of your life experiences have gotten you to the point where that's why you feel passionate, or you seem passionate about it when you express it. I'm never going to tell you you can't have your opinion. I'm never going to tell you that, you're wrong. I would just say that depending on your opinion, I disagree. But I'm a little confused because you do seem to recognize that Barack Obama was not a good individual. In one of your responses to Mike, Mike, damn it, it's not the pipe boss. Come on, what was his name? Oh, shit, come on. Why can't I get his name right now? Because we used to call each other by his last name, by our last names all the time. Okay, whatever. Mike, our Canadian brother. You seem to have some negative comments about Barack Obama. I don't know the man, so I don't know what was in his heart of hearts, but I don't think he was the best person to be president. I think he was groomed to be president by the Democratic National Convention very early because they didn't have anybody with his charisma. They didn't have anybody with his charm. They didn't have anybody with his poise. So they groomed him specifically to do a job. And I don't know how much of his presidency was his own individualism versus others. I do know that there were points during his presidency where the media outlets were already beginning to stir the pot of racial division with certain things that happened and things that were being reported in the media versus anything else. And he had an opportunity to lower the temperature. He had an opportunity to not throw more gas on the fire, but instead he chose to throw gas on the fire. And then again, a lot of his policies did not benefit America. With that in mind, Sydney, I'd like to share this with you. I didn't pay attention to politics until after the invasion of Iraq. When I came back from the invasion of Iraq, I remember George Bush was getting a lot of flack for his decision to send us there, a decision that both Democrats and Republicans agreed to make. And that kind of opened my eyes because for whatever reason at the time it made me feel like specifically the Democratic Party was trying to diminish the accomplishments of what we had just done. After over 8 years in service, I popped my combat cherry with the invasion of Iraq. To put that into scope, all of us that served together at the same time in Bravo 1-3, we all would have been right at about the 8-year mark, somewhere close to that, if we were all together in the same unit crossing the border into Iraq. We would have had we would have been like sitting at 2 hash marks getting our first combat experience. Some of us would have done good, some of us would have shit our pants when Crazy Ivan was no longer Crazy Ivan at Port Arms, but it was Abib and Muhammad who shot, moved, and communicated and didn't wear a uniform. So I come back, and all of a sudden these politicians are bad-mouthing my commander-in-chief, but more importantly, I felt like they were bad-mouthing what we had just done in Iraq. And it got me to pay attention. Fast forward to 2024, and a lot of the research I've done on my own behalf. Ever since their inception, going back to the pre-Civil War time frame and the founding of the Confederate States, the Democratic Party is the only political party that has ever opposed the United States of America through their actions and through their policies. It was the Democratic Party that seceded from the Union and initiated the Civil War with the attack on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. It was the Democratic Party that opposed civil rights and fought against Dr. Martin Luther King. It was the Democratic Party that was all about Jim Crow and segregation, and the Democratic Party was represented by a militant group known as the Ku Klux Klan, and they supported the Ku Klux Klan, and almost every member of the Democratic Party was a member of the KKK. It was the Democratic Party that opposed Republicans for the voting rights and all the things. All right? When John F. Kennedy was elected president, he was the most anti-Democrat there ever was. And the only reason he ran as a Democrat was because his father, Joe Kennedy, who was a belligerent racist, was loaded. And he would only ever get a chance to run on his father's money if he ran as a Democrat. But John F. Kennedy was more of a liberal, less of a Democrat. He's probably single-handedly the one that's most responsible for bringing change to the Democratic Party. Lyndon Johnson gets all the credit, and Strom Thurmond, who was one of 23 Dixiecrats, the Democratic Party loves to level not the blame, but the credit for the great switch of the Democrat and the Republican Party. It's a bullshit lie. 23 Dixiecrats were opposing Lyndon Johnson when he decided, hey, let's give the people what they want, equal rights. When in reality, what Lyndon Johnson wanted was he wanted the black community to start voting Democrat by increasing the welfare state so that the black community had a roof over their head, had food in their belly, they can shop where they wanted to shop, and they can go to school where they wanted to go to school. Just vote Democrat. 23 Dixiecrats disagreed and threatened to leave the Democratic Party. Of those 23, only one ever did, and that was Strom Thurmond. As far as how the South became predominantly Republican, it's because, for the most part, a lot of Southern children who were raised by black nannies started to change the view and change their opinion and change their own personal socio-political belief system. But there's one thing the South did do, and they maintained a sense of religion. And the Republican Party latched on to religion. So that's how the Republican Party gained a foothold in the South and maintained a foothold in the South. The reason Democrats gained a foothold in the North is, I forget his name, it's Bill something, but he was a Southern Democrat that moved up to New York because he had a great plan. For all intents and purposes, most people that we know as being evil and bad were geniuses. So this guy moves up to New York, and what he starts to do is he starts to campaign with the poor white laborers of the North against the, I guess what you would call the rich robber barons. So the industrial laborers who were being treated horrifically by the wealthy, this guy starts to generate support for the Democratic Party through the labor unions by forming labor unions up north. So that's how the Democrats formed a foothold. Trust me when I tell you, he had no intentions of trying to represent people of color. It was all about the poor white laborers and trying to generate a Democratic base up north to broaden the scope of the Democratic Party, which for the longest time had maintained a foothold in the South. So that's how the North started to switch Democrat, because if you look at it, all labor unions up north are basically Democrat. All of those that work for labor unions pretty much are forced and told to vote Democrat because the Democrats support labor unions. But the Democratic Party has only ever, through their actions and policies, been against the American people. I mean, Bill Clinton and NAFTA, you know, Barack Obama and his policies, and currently Joe Biden and his policies. I'm not saying the Republican Party's any better, but in lieu of a third neutral party, we're kind of stuck with what we're stuck with. But getting back to my original point, I believe the Democrats and their allies are pushing this narrative that does nothing more than stoke the fires of racial division, when I don't think we are actually that divided. But we live in a time during the 5th year of the 3rd decade of the 21st century where basically everybody but white people are allowed to be proud of their skin color. I mean, just answer that question. Can white people be proud to be white and not be labeled a racist? Or in order to be proud of anything, white people have to be proud of being Italian, being Irish, being Polish, being German, without coming across as a racist? You know, why is it everybody else gets to claim brown, yellow, purple, red, whatever, and it's not racist? Why is it that all these policies seek to essentially exclude white people? Is that not the very definition of racism? I mean, and then to try to level blame on people that never grew up in that era, never, you know, had anything to do with it, who more than likely come from the ancestors of those who actually fought alongside Dr. Martin Luther King for equal rights, because they viewed people as people and judged them based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. I mean, it took white people to get Dr. Martin Luther King's policies to come to life. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, I can't stand this division that's being perpetrated by the media, being purchased by regular American good people that, if you get down to it, are just good people. I don't think black people are at risk of the police. It's like Jim Carrey. So-and-so got caught breaking into another ATM and needs your expert, you know, legal advice. Stop breaking the law, asshole. I think anybody who does bad things is going to have interactions with the police. I think the media disproportionately reports them to send a false narrative. I don't think the police what are we going to do today, George? Let's go kill some people of color. Why? Because we have a badge. No. I think most cops wake up fearful that they're going to not come home to their families and go to work trying to protect people, knowing that in the 5th year of the 3rd decade of the 21st century, the entire country's against them. I mean, Steven Crowder talks about it all the time. Back during the race riots of Detroit, you could not be a black cop and not be in fear of your life. They had to sneak home in fear of being killed because they were on the wrong side of what was considered right. I mean, I just can't stand this. I mean, it's literally the 5th year of the 3rd decade of the 21st century, and I think the honest to God truth is we don't actually hate each other. We're being told to hate each other. We're being forced to hate each other. The media outlets are being driven by people who have a much bigger plan in store for us, people that are looking 7 moves ahead on the chessboard, that have found a way and done the math to find a way to profit from this division. And I think if we're not careful, if we don't see through the lies and the bullshit, that's where we're headed. Because the only reason I'm basically making this video is because when I think back to our time together in 1-3, you don't sound like the same guy I remember. And to be fair, I'm probably not the same guy you remember either. And I don't mean that in the negative. I mean, I'm going on 48 this year. I think when we knew each other, I wasn't even 25. My concerns were show up, do the job, go on Libo, meet girls. Politics, socio-political topics, I could give a shit about. So yeah, I'm a bit more informed. I'm a bit more involved. And if the same goes for you, I get it. Knowing you the way that I did back in the day, I'm going to assume that you have your reasons for believing the way you do. I don't have to agree, but I also don't have to think you're a bad person. I don't have to think that you're a demon. I don't have to think that you're unworthy of recognition or human affection or positive attributes. I can just simply state that, you know, on these topics, on these subjects, on these areas, I disagree. I disagree with placing so much precedence and importance on skin color that maybe right now you do. But still think you're a good person. Still, I don't think you're a bad dude. And I think that's important. I think we need to recognize that regardless of what we disagree on, we probably agree on more than what we do disagree on. And I'm tired of being told that no, if we don't agree on one particular subject, we have to hate each other. We have to take up arms and be prepared to go to combat against each other. That I don't believe. I believe there are people that want that. I believe there are people that believe that there is something to be gained by forcing that outcome. But I don't think that's necessary. So, Sydney, I hope you get a chance to watch this. I think what I'll do is I'll message you a link to this video. Anybody else who's watching this, please leave a comment. I don't give a shit if they're positive or negative. I don't care if you're so proud of your skin color, all you see is a white bigot and you just got to let your feelings fly. Do what you got to do. You be you. I'm not somebody who gives a shit about my skin color. I was born this way. I don't have any say-so over it. Like I don't have any say-so about the hair that grows on my shoulders. I don't have any say-so over the fact that my hairline is growing back and I now have a 6 head. I don't have any say-so over the fact that I have to wear glasses. So if your skin color is heavily attached to your identity and it means that much to you that you got to try and tear me down and call me racist and call me all these things, I think it makes you ignorant. And if you're placing precedence on your own skin color, I think that makes you the racist. But by all means, it's a free country. Leave your comments. If you want to get involved in the conversation, that's all I'm trying to do is stimulate conversation because I think we need to have it. I think we need to have these conversations. I think we need to be able to have these discussions whether we agree or disagree because I think we need to have them outside of the media that's trying to tell us what to think. But that's just me. Appreciate your time. This is probably one of those that you're going to want to listen to versus watch. I'm probably not going to do a whole lot of editing if for no other reason. I'm lazy. And I don't give a shit to learn how to do editing. So with that being said, y'all be safe. Till next time, you're awesome.